Welcome to the IDB Pavilion of the Americas, where we translate conversation into action, and welcome to the Climate Tech Innovation and Climate Action event. I'd like to introduce to Yuri Soares, Chief Impact Officer from IDB Lab. Yuri, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for spending an hour of your afternoon with us. I hope we're going to get us a wonderful discussion on climate technologies in Latin America and how they're shaping the future of climate action. So I'm going to just very briefly mention who's on the panel. They will introduce themselves when they start their own discussions. We have Juan David from Latin Pacto. We have Andy from Climate Kick, Shuko from SP Ventures, and Yelan from IDB Invest. And we have Patrick Brothers from Holland IQ. Patrick is in the process of doing a study, landscape study of climate tech entrepreneurs. So I'm going to start by asking Patrick to do a brief presentation of what the landscape of climate tech looks like. Thank you so much, Patrick. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Yuri. I wish I was with you all. Wonderful to play a small part in help setting the scene. Let me just share a few slides and spend a little over 5 minutes zooming all the way up to 50,000 feet before we hear insights from our experts on some specifics. Of course, we all know this, but it would be remiss of me to leave out that Latin America and the Caribbean is already a powerhouse across energy, and increasingly, as we'll see in renewables, some real case studies of global leadership. A magnificent resource of metals and minerals that will be absolutely critical to the energy transition to electric vehicles and to electrification. And perhaps the most well-known role globally from a food security perspective is the agricultural economies, which are powering the region and the world as well, with food security and with much innovation as well. The region, as powerful and as innovative as it is also very vulnerable. And we see that in the IPCC data. This is a generalization of very, very specific assessments across the region. Of course, often when we look at LAC, we think of these 4 regions. We see how vulnerable the Caribbean is and how vulnerable the whole region is. There's actually 4 major assessments by the IPCC here. The low assessment doesn't feature at all, where it does in many other parts of the world. From top to bottom here, you see the intensity of the vulnerability across each of these regions. Vulnerability in populations in poverty and their livelihoods. Vulnerabilities across water, cities and infrastructure, the food systems, health, and terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems as well. When we dive in much deeper, and I know this will be tiny on the screen in front of you, but of course, Latin America and the Caribbean is a very diverse region with lots of unique attributes by country and within countries as well. Different land masses, different parts, a significant part of the planet, a significant part of the global population and humanity. Very varying levels of GDP per capita as we think about wealth and about poverty and those we need to protect through the climate transition as well. In some areas, very high levels of urbanization. In others, not so much. And of course, with such a vast agricultural ecosystem, a significant rural capacity as well. Latin America and the Caribbean has some really world-leading levels of renewable generation across electricity generation when we look domestically in each country as well. Of course, it varies quite significantly, as you can see here represented, and the same with fossil fuels in total energy supply. In some markets, again, not a surprise, very significant levels, but very varying. All that to say, Latin America and the Caribbean, of course, we're representing here in its totality, but is made up of so many unique and different circumstances. Yuri referred to a study that we're conducting at the moment. We're really deep diving to understand climate tech and innovation in Latin America and the Caribbean. Recently, we screened and identified over 1,000 climate tech companies across the region. And you see here the general distribution in that first screening of those 1,000 companies. We see a greater representation in the biosphere than we do in many other parts of the world. Still not enough. nature-based solutions, land and soil, forests, oceans, and waterways. Of course, in the previous session, I was just listening to, coastlines, etc. The food system, no surprise there, given the magnificent agricultural system, smart farming, crops and livestock innovation. Of course, this is an area where we still have definition wrestles about what is core agriculture traditional and what is innovation. And we're on that spectrum. I think it's important that Latin America and the Caribbean acknowledges how much innovation is actually happening that might be dismissed locally as just core. The circular economy, a really significant representation, sustainable materials, solid waste and wastewater, waste to energy, carbon markets, less so, carbon capture, exchanges, offsets, accounting, data and finance, building, that includes metrics, IoT, Earth observation, climate data, climate insurance, a significant build compared to what we see globally in resources. Some of that, of course, a consequence of the critical minerals capacity that the region has. Not so much hydrogen and nuclear, but bio and synthetic fuels, absolutely. Renewables, as we all know who are familiar with the region, just an enormous solar capacity, enormous hydro capacity, not equally distributed, of course, and lots of potential, absolutely lots of potential. Energy storage, actually well developed from what we initially expected. We're talking batteries, EV grids, peer-to-peer networks, non-battery and alternative storage. The built environment, you saw the levels of urbanization on the previous slide, quite significant. Further developments in the electrification of transport, heating and cooling, residential and commercial buildings, and then onto mobility, whether that's micro-mobility, road vehicles, train, ships, and even aviation as well. When we double click in, you see each of those 10 bars represented here as columns from left to right. And we're double clicking right in to see the detail of these 1,000 companies. A significant representation in smart farming, significant representation in sustainable materials. Not a surprise, significant representation in solar, grids, and the built environment as well. All this to say, there is actually a thriving climate tech ecosystem, but it needs support. It needs funding. It needs policy. It needs all forms of talent, upskilling in order to thrive and achieve its true potential. For the third year in a row, this is actually a sneak preview. Next week, we're announcing our third annual Latin America Climate Tech 50, an assessment of the most promising climate tech companies across the region that are less than 10 years old and have not exited yet either. So we're trying to focus on those smaller, earlier stage organizations that are in the beginnings of their journey as well. And here we see that strong representation in the food system, circular economy as well, and great examples and case studies. I'm sure we've missed some magnificent examples. No doubt the panel will bring some of those into the fore as well. And then finally, as we reflect on the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, compared to the rest of the world, here we see last year's Climate Tech 1000. So we identify the top climate tech companies across many regions of the world to look for that diversity and that inspiration. We see that enormous representation in agriculture and food, which is not a surprise. But when we compare that around the rest of the world, we see there's potential for investment in other areas which are as important to the region in terms of innovation and balancing the strengths of Latin America and the Caribbean and the challenges as well, and also the opportunity to support the rest of the world through their transition too. Which brings me to kind of our working hypothesis around the significant strengths and significant assets that we see developing in climate tech across Latin America and the Caribbean to support and protect the domestic, local, regional population, but also to support other parts of the world. Such a rich biodiversity and natural resource asset collection. Such a fantastic set of examples leading renewable energy generation. And given the landmass that Latin America and the Caribbean is so lucky to have, huge potential as well. A very mostly well understood role in global food security and supporting that through the next 10, 50, 100 years. Critical minerals we've talked about. This is better understood, but also a significant opportunity. And also oceans and coastlines, Latin America and the Caribbean, such a significant amount of coastline. Of course, there are vulnerabilities there, but the innovation we expect and we hope to see can be shared with others around the world as well. I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that helped set the scene for our panel to kind of dive into specifics. Thank you, Yuri.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Wonderful intro and just great call out. We're doing this study together with IDB Invest, our partners in crime here, and it's great to have like a sneak peek of some of the first findings. So let me turn to Keelan first. Keelan, this is an optimistic scenario, right? It's a scenario of innovation, of change, of new possibilities, and huge assets that the region has compared to the rest of the world. What is IDB Invest doing to leverage these assets and kind of make good on this promise?
Thank you, Yuri, for the question, and thank you so much for everybody for joining this very, very interesting topic. So let me tell you about what IDB Invest is doing towards the future. We are in the process of getting a capital increase. We have requested from our shareholders an increase in capital because we want to change the business model that we had, that it was based on what in the lingo of MDBs is called the originate to hold. Basically, we lend money to an asset and we hold it until the transaction is ended, to an originate to share. Why? Because we need to move from the billions to the trillions, and there's a lot of capital out there that just needs to be linked to specific assets in the region. And so what we are trying to propose is to be this conduit, bring the resources, and identify or showcase the institutional investors of across the world that these assets are good to a good return on investment. Now, specifically for climate change, that will have 60% of our investments in the coming years will be towards climate and green investments. But how do we start? We start by knowing that there are assets, right? And so it's not only projects. Yes, we can develop projects and the infrastructure projects are good, but having this partnership with IDB Lab and focusing on this continuum from the small investments or these ideas, all the challenges that IDB Lab has, including with Latimpacto, that try to source or identify potential ideas that then can be scaled with an investment of IDB Invest is crucial.
Wonderful. Why don't we do a little bit of a kind of a deep dive? We saw Patrick mention the size of the climate tech vertical in agriculture. Okay, so it's grown a lot. However, we've yet to see kind of the transformational technologies that happen in energy, happen in mobility, in materials. We've yet to see those happen in agriculture. Francisco, you think this is happening soon or now? So tell us about your vision. Where do you see this coming from?
Hi, Yuri. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank everybody for being here. So in terms of optimism, being in the trenches and seeing this ecosystem over the past 10, 12 years evolve in the early stage startup, ag, and climate intersection, I'm probably the biggest optimist because I've seen how much and how far we have come. First, the broadness of the solutions. We're seeing a lot of entrepreneurial activity reaching inside academics and bringing these scientific innovations to market, whether it's in agriculture, livestock, upstream, downstream, life sciences, or digital. So very broad and tackling the very systemic bottlenecks of our food chain. And agriculture in our region, it can be perceived as a major culprit of climate change in terms of CO2 emissions, deforestation, expansion of the agricultural frontier, but it's also the most exposed and vulnerable sector and it's also carrying one of the biggest international externalities of climate change, which is being a pillar of global food security. So going down in Brazil specifically, Brazil today feeds over 800 million people globally from a 210 million population. So it's a major fundamental pillar of price stability, commodity price stability. So there's no way that we can have a retraction over there. So I mean, we are seeing very comprehensive activity, and we're seeing evolving quality. So what do I mean by evolving quality? Better entrepreneurs, more adoption, and more robust broad funding syndicates in terms of international investors, whether from the DFIs, but especially from generalist venture investors, international ag tech investors. So, I mean, we're very optimistic.
That's wonderful. I didn't know that statistic of the 800 million. That's critical. You know, you're gonna have enormous population growth in Africa, in India, and we're well positioned to be part of the solution in terms of agriculture and through ag tech in a way that's sustainable, that's low carbon. So let me turn to Juan David. Juan David from Latin Pacto. Green Catalytic Fund. How is that going to be part of what we're talking about here? How is that going to be an enabler?
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much, Judy, for the invitation and everyone for being here. The Green Catalytic Fund is a very interesting instrument that we've been building together with the IDB lab and structuring it for over a year. And as the name says, it will deploy what we call catalytic capital. Catalytic capital actually involves two main areas, the one on venture philanthropy that we can talk about that later, and as well on concessional finance, which is another part where we can actually take outsized risks and provide more flexible capital towards the growth of the impact ecosystem around decarbonization and net zero solutions. So how we will be an enabler. So part of the plan is especially that, unlocking solutions that are at a very early stage, that are using as well technology components in the areas of, as I mentioned before, decarbonization and net zero solutions. What we really want is to create and to find those organizations with a very strong potential for growth, with a very strong potential for scale, who are at a very early stage or within that part of the entrepreneurship pathway that we call the valley of death, that are organizations that are too big to continue to be dependent only on grant financing, or too small to be able to access other type of capital markets. So that's like the sweet spot where we want to focus, and where there are, of course, it's called the valley of death because most of the entrepreneurs don't get out of there. But we want really to be able to deploy this capital to find those solutions and to support as well the growth of these organizations. Taking risk, being more patient. That's what as well we're very happy to collaborate with the IDB lab, because at the moment that we sat down, they say, okay, this is about taking risks. This is about being visionaries about what we're doing. So the focus is that hopefully in the next couple of presentations that Patrick will make, the number of climate tech organizations are even bigger, are more robust, and pretty much the other value added of our initiative together, where we're also bringing as well some corporates such as Coca-Cola, such as Bayer. We have also others on the pipeline, is to be able to, when the moment is right, connect these organizations that we have supported with other impact investors, with new financial vehicles. And that is a way in which Latin Pacto, represented by 200 organizations in Latin America, mostly impact capital providers, and through its larger network, the Global Alliance of Impact Networks, with over 1,200 impact investors, these organizations can continue their growth trajectory and be able to scale growth and cover more of their impact purpose.
That's amazing. Stay tuned. We're gonna have like a call to action following up on the Green Catalytic Fund. So I'm trying to put all of this together, right? So we have a growing ecosystem. We have an acceleration of the ecosystem. We have finance that's gonna take risks that normally can't be taken. We have big capital with IDB Invest and their new model for capital, which is super exciting. We have IDB on the public policy side. So Andy, Climate Kick is Europe's leading climate innovation initiative. You're the chief strategy officer. How do we put all this together? How do we make success out of this kind of alphabet soup?
Thanks, Yuri. And hello, everyone. Our work really over the last decade and a half has been really doing some of what we have been hearing about just now. It has been supporting the very early stage ideas. It's been, we've incubated over 2,000 companies. We've helped them access the markets and so on. But one of our experiences in Europe, and what we're also finding now that we're working in Africa and Latin America with IDB Lab, is that not enough of these really fantastic ideas are scaling at the speed required for us to deliver climate targets or climate resilience. And so one of the things that we have been doing over the last 4 or 5 years is really trying to say, okay, we know how to build these enabling ecosystems. We know how to build these places which are fertile ground to bring startups through. What we haven't yet seen is on the demand side is how do we create the platforms, the markets that will start to pull them through at speed as well, which de-risks both the startup who are trying to pull through, helps the investor so that we can really scale. Let me just give you an example in just from a European context. We talk about cities. We're leading the cities mission in Europe, which is 112 cities trying to get to net zero by 2030. Hugely ambitious. Yeah. Now each city we reckon needs something like 10 to 15 billion euros. Yeah, that's €1 trillion market. So when we look at the verticals that Patrick was showing around the urban environment, the finance, fintech, the energy grids, the renewables, and so on, all of that comes into one space, which is the cities, which they then need to do. If we can use that platform that we have built with 100 cities, we can then actually test, learn, scale, and replicate these solutions very, very rapidly. Fantastic for the startup, fantastic for the investors, yeah, because it's a de-risked way of scaling rapidly. So those are the sorts of things we're doing in cities, in agri-food, in circular economy.
Super interesting. And I love this vision of kind of an ecosystem as a platform almost, right? I really haven't thought about it in those sense before. So a little bit back to you, Keelan, and I guess one question is, IDB Invest has led on renewables. You've led on, you have some of the most kind of innovative and interesting financial models, including the one that we mentioned yesterday in Chile in energy with Engie. The question is, how do you see IDB Invest getting into new verticals where perhaps, obviously we have a relationship that we work together, but how do you see in your strategy moving forward addressing verticals where maybe the decarbonization pathway has not been as positive and as dramatic as maybe electromobility and energy?
Two ways, I think, to put it simply. On the one hand, we know that there are targets of sustainability that big anchor companies are having because they respond to the EU mandates or even the US. They more and more need to disclose on their climate risks. So there is that demand for larger companies from larger companies that need solutions to, for example, know that they're reducing their scope 3, but they need a solution that will track their emissions. They will tell them the baseline, they will tell them how they're doing, and maybe even with their power of purchasing a service from a company that is low carbon, they can even reduce their emissions and they can achieve their goals. So in that sense, there are examples of companies that we have worked from the beginning in Brazil, a transportation company that because they are able to track their emissions, they become an interesting company to hire as a provider of transportation of goods and services in Brazil. So that's one side. The other side is those startups that are interesting because they produce the data. And I think that companies that are producing data in terms of GHG emissions or physical and transition risks are critical. And we haven't seen enough of those, right? Of course, this is only like two types of companies, but I think that in the engagement of trying to see what are the solutions for a low carbon and decarbonization pathway and resiliency pathway in the region, that's critical. The other side is that we ourselves have a Paris alignment commitment. And because we have a Paris alignment commitment and we are going to make our financial flows go to companies that are low carbon, we are looking for those assets to invest in. So we will have to diversify because not everything is on renewable energy, but we will have to achieve low carbon, or let's say, put it differently. We will have to support high emitting sectors in their decarbonization pathways. And if we do that, we will need companies that have to do with materials, for example, to offer an option, an opportunity, like an alternative for the companies in the region that have used traditional aluminum, for example.
I mean, I guess one thing that jumped out at me is kind of the interdependencies that you were talking about. You spoke of data, and data cuts across several verticals for sure. Let me turn to you, Francisco, about another interdependency or another complicated vertical, which is finance, fintech, right? So we were talking about, and it's not unrelated to digital. So we were talking about how fintech and kind of innovations in finance and fintech in particular have become enablers for the climate tech agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe also the experience of Brazil in terms of the regulatory framework and how this has been really a game changer?
For sure. So Ag FinTech has been probably our most intense area of investment. If I look at our fund two, I believe 38% of the portfolio was in Ag FinTech, from Mexico all the way to Brazil. So we're seeing a pretty broad phenomenon. So the region has created over the past 10 years several very large revolutionary companies in the fintech space, thanks to digital transformation and deregulation. So companies that have become household names such as Nubank, Stone, etc. Then when we look at farming, a few things are super important. First of all, farming is probably one of the most working capital intensive businesses, major verticals in the planet. Farmers have to buy inputs today to be able to have their harvest in 6, 9, 10 months, depending on the crop, sometimes longer. And they have to finance a kind of risk that traditional lenders are not used to running. It's biological risk, it's climate risk, it's FX risk, it's commodity price risk, a series of very sophisticated risks, right? And especially on the climate risk perspective, it's a risk that is growing, becoming more uncertain. So it transforms the process even harder. We see a lot of innovative business models of young technology companies partnering up with retailers in the ag space to be able to originate the credit process, use the horizontal brokerage companies like XP that are being born to distribute banking products, and be able to join capital markets directly to farmers. So a sector that has been traditionally dominated by government subsidies and banks, what we're seeing is as farming grows, becomes riskier, government budgets become more constrained after COVID and after they become a little bit more fiscally full, capital markets are starting to be able to fill the gap and generate more competition to finance farmers. Now, this is critical with technology and simply bringing digital and new business model innovations to be able to offer more competitive economics in terms of farmer origination credit scoring process, credit concession, credit monitoring, and collection as well.
Let me just ask another question on what's the potential that you see of kind of extending the last mile of reach, smaller producers, more isolated, with kind of this fintech model, right? How can we address that? And I'll go to Juan David later, but I want to hear from you a little bit. How do you see that being possible?
So one of the companies that was mentioned in Patrick's presentation, AgroLend, if you look at their customer portfolio, farmer customer portfolio, it already includes middle and especially small growers. So through technology, you've been able to reach this guy who has been completely marginalized from the credit markets because it's simply hard to get data on him in traditional ways. It's very expensive to service this guy through the traditional bricks and mortar retail side. So I think the current transformation is already starting to trickle down to this guy. We have companies like AgroSmart that deliver technology, irrigation, monitoring data, and can supply this data to banks and other funds that can also help access this guy. And there's a third revolution, which is the distribution, the marketplace. Companies like Arado, which do fresh produce and work with small retailers on their marketplace. When we see the marketplace where farmers are able to sell their fresh produce and reduce intermediaries, these also become very potential channels to distribute inputs and credit as well in a more efficient manner. So I have no doubt that the small grower will be a beneficiary of having access not only to financial products, but also closer access to end markets and being able to get more predictability on what they should be planting and what the economics are going to be. Remember, farming is probably the most uncertain and risky activity an entrepreneur can go into, and having tools and financial services solutions is critical to be able to manage this uncertainty.
No, it's tremendous. It's difficult to be a farmer. So financial services tech is allowing us to get to that last mile. Platforms, marketplace platforms, tech is allowing us to reach, or farmers to transact and get better prices. Smart farming, that probably is also going to be able to eventually get to smaller farmers. So I guess all this goes to Juan David is how important is the social dimension, the impact that the social dimension, we see it all over discussions at COP. We can't separate the two. And how important is that, and how do you see that playing out?
Sure. Yeah. Working. Yes. Well, the first step with the fund is to be as inclusive as possible. Just go beyond the usual partners. We are always fostering the idea within our network that you need to break down silos and start working as well and uncovering as well unusual partners, unusual solutions. So in that way, you create a more ample base of organizations that can benefit from our initiatives and the ones of our members. We really want as well to work with a diversity, equity, and inclusion focus, because that offers a lot more actually of intersectionality, which is and interdependence, which is something extremely important. And in that way, we can also uncover solutions that are being led, that are being thought, that are being designed with vulnerable groups. People at the base of pyramid, indigenous communities. In Brazil, the importance as well, and it should be in all Latin America, the importance of Black communities, that is extremely important. So having as well them involved in this process is extremely important. The second part, which I believe it's super interesting, is the focus that we give to the decarbonization pathways and the low carbon pathways that we want to work with. I was just reading in the plane here a book called the value of a whale that says that one of the main problems that we're having is that when it comes to carbon accounting, we are trying to put all the emissions in the same bag, and we are not accounting for context. We are not accounting for nuances. We are not accounting for all the different factors and who are the emitters of these GHG, these greenhouse gases. So by understanding this, we really want to work in those areas where investment, especially early stage investment or early stage support, in areas where that need corporate stewardship and that need as well the mobilization of the private sector are crucial. So in that way, we can actually start addressing those that must be changed quickly, so we can actually then start deploying our capital in those who need a more slow or patient transition.
Oh, super important. And I mean, one of the worries that I have is that somehow we leave. So we see in agriculture, the southern cone, tremendous productivity increases, feeding 800 million people. And then we compare it to regions such as, Central America, certain parts of the Andean areas where there's very little productivity increase, right? And we're talking about the unit economics being a challenge for reaching those areas. So let me pivot a little bit. Andy, yesterday, some people probably read it before me, but I read an interesting piece that McKinsey had put out for the COP, and what they were talking about how far in each vertical, how far new technologies are in terms of cost to be able to displace incumbents, right? Low carbon or zero carbon technologies, and some of them are already displacing incumbents and renewables. Some of them are pretty far out still. What are like the best practices, or what can we do now in an ecosystem and partnerships and policy to accelerate that gap shrinking or disappearing? What can we do?
So I guess the work that we are working with others and with partners in across Latin America in that space, as well as in Africa and Europe, has been actually to try and take a much more systemic view about how do we bring these technologies through. So, and again, it would be of no surprise to know that, so many of what has stopped some of these may be regulatory misalignment. Yeah. Or it might be just that the financing package doesn't quite work to help scale something up. We haven't got the blended finance quite right between the public and the private to allow the private money to go from what we think of as the learning to scaling challenge. There's no shortage of pilot projects doing fantastic things with good venture money or philanthropy and so on. Getting that to the point where you bring it into the capital markets, you get institutional investors, the insurers, the pension funds investing into these types of solutions is a real challenge. So for us, again, there's a lot that we can do working with the investment community, working with the regulators, working with the ecosystems themselves, and obviously the banks, to actually just help try and reduce that gap so that we're not seeing, it's not assumed to be a heavy lift just by a technology coming in and magically cutting across. I do think some of the innovation models that we have in our mind have come out of a sort of software as a service model out of the US, which kind of assume that once you've done the initial development, you can scale it around the world at very limited, very low cost. In practice, most of the climate tech we're talking about are highly regulated markets. They are inherently local, many of the solutions. Of course, you can scale them or replicate them, but you have to take in the local political, social, cultural context to some of these issues. So actually, in order to make that work, you have to build these ecosystems in every jurisdiction, in every place where you can actually start to tackle each of these barriers and break them down so we can get the rapid scaling that we want. And that's kind of where we're working, which is that take a systemic view, tackle these levers, but that needs bringing people, often quite radical collaborations between big corporates and startups, between investors and municipal authorities. They're uncomfortable, yeah, because people are not used to the language, they're not used to the experience. But bringing them together actually helps us to scale quickly, which is what we need to do.
So I guess the example of financial regulation that we were talking about in Brazil would fall within what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly that. And we're seeing it in multiple places. You know, a good example has been around, you know, for the very big investors after the financial crash 2008. We saw a lot of regulation coming in to try and say it's all about liquidity. Yeah, you have to mark all your assets to market. Yeah, but actually, what we need is vast amounts of money into illiquid assets, which are infrastructure, to make the change happen, into renewables, to energy efficiency, into new materials. That's all illiquid. Yeah, and we've just set the rules to basically try and restrict how much goes into illiquid assets. Yeah, so we end up with these. It's almost like the regulators are solving for the last problem rather than solving for tomorrow's problem. And that's not the fault of the regulator, but it's just understanding that we need to be much more nimble in how we see and how we develop the markets to allow the finance to work effectively.
Absolutely. Let me. I think we're coming up on time here, so I'm going to ask each of you to kind of what is your takeaway from the panel in terms of if you had to like pick one thing that we really need to accelerate that we're not doing. Okay, we talked a lot about things we are doing, we're going to do things that we are not doing that we'd like to do differently. And what would that be if you had to pick one or two? And I'm sorry I didn't give Keelan much time to think about. I'll start with you. So what do we need to do that we're not doing? What is it that we need to change?
So I think the point of bringing everybody to the table and recognizing that we do not understand each other and that we may use the same term in a different way, it's something difficult because nobody wants to say, I didn't understand what you said, or I don't understand what you're talking about when you're talking about illiquidity or liquidity or FX risk or what have you, right? And so having those conversations that are not necessarily difficult, but leveling the playing field of concepts, I think is a start, but we haven't done it.
Wow.
Yeah, no. So I'll give my view on probably what we see as the most missing area of investment in our portfolio, but that I've seen across, and that for me it's a paradox. As we see the perception of climate risk increasing, we've been monitoring and seeking to invest in insurance tech in the region, as we see that through multi-peril ag insurance, crop insurance, you can remove certain aspects of the risk of farming and consequently catalyze and mobilize private sector credit and develop other markets, which have been shy because of this. But because the regulatory framework, the conservative side of insurance, perhaps is still a little bit behind in many of the countries in the region, InsurTech has been a particular blind spot in our deal flow. So being able to build a new insurance industry, tech-driven, prepared to deal with the current aspects of the market and distribution, and using new technologies like AI to more efficiently price insurance premiums and policies is an area that I think we need to be more engaged. And this means being engaged with the existing insurance players, being engaged with the sandbox. Brazil specifically, the insurance regulatory agency has a sandbox to try new technologies, being able to mobilize more entrepreneurs and get more activity here, more entrepreneurial activity.
And we were talking before that there's a potential for us to kind of engage public policy more towards the insurtech and perhaps less towards support for loans and farm subsidies. So I mean that might be one way we can accelerate exactly what you're talking about.
For sure, we have no idea that insurance subsidy and sponsorship generates a much bigger bang for the buck than subsidizing credit directly to farmers.
Juan David, what's keeping you up at night? What do we need to do differently?
Yeah. So three main ideas that I just wrote down. First, more action-based collaboration. We're very happy as well, always to and here, for example, at COP, to bring out pledges, to bring out ideas, commitments, but action-based, of course, is still lacking, and we need to mobilize more action-based. And it's really interesting to see as well here examples of that happening. I avoid duplication. That is something as well super important. And for that as well, for example, the creation of databases and open access that are open access is extremely important. That provide insights as well to organizations structuring, to organizations deploying, to organizations who are to venturing organizations, entrepreneurs. That is extremely important. And the final is if we really want to unlock high impact climate solutions, we need to go beyond our comfort spaces, and that means, of course, taking more risks, and that is something that is key for us, and as well creating more and structuring vehicles that adapt to the needs of the communities, of the entrepreneurs, because sometimes the market is too focused on designing super interesting, sometimes even complex vehicles, but when they need to go down, they start facing as well the pipeline project. So in order to solve that, we need to be more aware on and be more willing to take risks.
And Andy, what's keeping you up at night? What do we need to do differently here?
Well, I mean, I think we've been hearing what a fantastic potential there is. There is this astonishing set of ideas, entrepreneurs coming through. Yeah. For me, one of the challenges is to get away from seeing it simply in verticals, to think about those place-based platforms to pull the markets through, because what happens in, as you said, the Southern Cone is very different from the conditions of what might work in the North or in the Andean countries. So for me, about building those platforms and then creating that market demand with that enabling, policy, finance, and so on, that's the way in which we will pull through those solutions very rapidly and allow export as well beyond that.
Wonderful. So we need to learn from each other and talk the same language. We really don't. These high impact verticals like InsurTech, and maybe we just need to unlock them somehow. The issue of collaboration and risk taking, and I love the platforms that are going to be like these demand pull platforms also. So just absolutely wonderful. I want to thank the panel. Great panel today. Thank you very much, and a round of applause.